This is something you are not supposed to hear. Not from the pulpit, not in most seminaries, and certainly not from the comfortable voices of modern religious commentary that have learned to soften everything until nothing feels urgent anymore. But if you are willing to listen carefully, I want to show you something that is already unfolding around you. Not in some distant prophetic timeline, not in abstract theological debate, but here in real time, inside families, inside homes, inside the minds of young people who have no idea what they are walking into. I have spent many years in the ministry of exorcism and pastoral care, and I can tell you without exaggeration that what I am seeing now is not what I saw even a few decades ago. The patterns are different. The pressure is different. The way spiritual disturbance manifests in people, in families, and entire communities carries a weight that feels intensified, accelerated, and far more widespread than anything we were trained to expect. This is not about fear for its own sake. It is about recognition. Something in the spiritual climate has shifted, and most people are still living as if nothing has changed. When people hear language like this, they often assume it is metaphorical or symbolic. But I am not speaking in abstractions. I am speaking from lived pastoral experience, from encounters with suffering that cannot be reduced to psychology alone, from moments where the line between ordinary human struggle and something more oppressive becomes impossible to ignore. What is especially concerning is not just the presence of spiritual struggle, but the lack of preparation. Many believers, even practicing Catholics, are living with almost no awareness of spiritual reality. They attend Mass occasionally, they identify with the faith culturally, but they are not formed, not grounded, not protected in the way that tradition once assumed every Christian would be. And this is where the crisis becomes more serious. Because while many assume that religious practice today is simply weaker or less frequent than in the past, the deeper issue is that the entire understanding of spiritual life has been reshaped. In many places, the supernatural has been softened into metaphor. The devil, for many, is no longer a real intelligence but a symbol of evil. Spiritual warfare is no longer understood as an actual struggle, but as psychological language for internal conflict. Even within some theological environments, there has been a tendency to treat these realities as outdated or pre-scientific ways of speaking. But reality does not change because our language about it changes. What this has produced is a generation that is spiritually unguarded. Not because they are more evil than previous generations, but because they are less aware of the consequences of what they are engaging with. Practices that were once clearly identified as spiritually dangerous are now treated as harmless curiosity. Occult tools, divination practices, attempts to access hidden knowledge, and even certain forms of so-called spiritual experimentation are widely normalized. At the same time, there is a growing openness to practices that intentionally empty the mind or detach the self from thought, often presented as wellness techniques, without any awareness of the spiritual traditions that historically warned against such states of vulnerability. The tragic irony is that many people who no longer believe in the spiritual world are nevertheless interacting with it in ways they do not understand. And because they do not believe they are engaging with anything real beyond themselves, they do so without caution, without discernment, and without protection. From a pastoral perspective, this is one of the most dangerous combinations possible: exposure without belief, participation without awareness, engagement without formation. At the same time, there is another layer to this crisis that cannot be ignored. The collapse of sacramental understanding within Christian communities has left many without the very structure that was meant to sustain spiritual life. The sacraments in traditional theology are not symbolic rituals added to faith as decoration. They are the means by which grace is communicated, sustained, and restored. When that understanding weakens, practice inevitably follows. And when practice weakens, people gradually lose the lived experience of grace altogether, even while retaining religious identity. What concerns me most is not simply that fewer people are practicing, but that many no longer even understand what has been lost. A person can only recognize what is absent if they first understand what was meant to be present. Without that awareness, spiritual decline does not feel like loss. It feels normal. It feels like modernity. It feels like progress. And so we arrive at a situation where spiritual vulnerability increases, while spiritual awareness decreases, where exposure to harmful influences grows, while the ability to discern them weakens, where entire populations move through life without the protective framework that earlier generations, rightly or wrongly, assumed as foundational. I am telling you this not to create panic, but to restore clarity. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The question is no longer whether spiritual struggle exists. The question is whether you are living as if it does. What becomes more difficult to ignore as you continue looking at this reality honestly is that the changes we are observing are not random or isolated. They appear interconnected, almost structural, as if different parts of human life are being reshaped at the same time in ways that reinforce each other. When spiritual awareness declines, moral boundaries tend to weaken. When moral boundaries weaken, vulnerability increases. And when vulnerability increases across an entire culture, the effects eventually show up in places people do not immediately connect to spiritual causes. From a theological perspective, especially within classical Christian thought, this is not surprising. Human beings are not purely material. They are integrated beings, body and soul, and what affects one dimension inevitably influences the other. When the interior life is disordered or neglected, it does not remain private. It begins to express itself outwardly in behavior, relationships, institutions, and even in cultural assumptions about what is normal or acceptable. This is why traditional theology places so much emphasis on formation. Not just belief in a general sense, but structured formation of the mind, the will, and the imagination. Because without formation, human beings do not remain neutral. They are shaped anyway, by environment, by repetition, by influence, by exposure. And in the absence of intentional spiritual formation, other forces fill that space, whether ideological, psychological, or what older language would simply call temptational. One of the most significant shifts in recent decades has been the reduction of religious life to something private and optional. Faith for many has become one aspect of identity rather than the organizing center of life. This change may seem subtle, but its consequences are not. When faith is no longer central, it no longer shapes decisions in a consistent way. And when it no longer shapes decisions, it slowly loses its authority, even in areas where people still claim to believe. This is where contradiction begins to form inside modern religious life. Many still identify as believers, but their practical assumptions about reality are often indistinguishable from those who do not. The supernatural is acknowledged in theory, but rarely in practice. Moral teachings are affirmed in principle, but selectively applied in lived experience. Over time, this creates a kind of internal fragmentation, where belief exists but without integration. From a pastoral standpoint, this fragmentation is one of the most common issues encountered in spiritual care. It is not always dramatic or visible. It often appears as quiet inconsistency, spiritual fatigue, or a sense of distance from what people once described as a living relationship with God. In more severe cases, it can manifest as long-term patterns of sin, repeated failure in the same areas, or a growing sense that prayer has become ineffective or empty. It is important to be precise here. Not every struggle has a spiritual cause, and not every difficulty is evidence of external influence. Human psychology, trauma, environment, and personal choice all play significant roles in shaping behavior, but classical spiritual theology does not reduce everything to psychology either. It recognizes that the human person exists within a broader moral and spiritual order, and that certain patterns of resistance, temptation, and oppression cannot always be fully explained by natural causes alone. This is where discernment becomes essential. Without discernment, everything is either over-spiritualized or under-spiritualized. Both extremes are dangerous. One leads to superstition, the other to denial. The traditional approach insists on a balanced recognition that human freedom is real, psychological factors are real, and spiritual influences are real, and that all must be considered carefully and responsibly. At the same time, there is another development that must be acknowledged honestly. The weakening of communal religious life has left many individuals isolated in their struggles. Where earlier generations would have relied on shared practices, regular confession, stable parish life, and consistent moral accountability, many today experience their spiritual life in isolation. Even when surrounded by others, their inner struggles remain largely unseen and unspoken. Isolation, in any form, increases vulnerability. This is true psychologically and spiritually. When people no longer have structures of accountability, guidance, or shared faith practice, their internal struggles tend to intensify. Patterns that might have been addressed early through confession, counsel, or communal support instead become entrenched over time. This is why traditional Christian practice emphasized not only personal devotion, but also communal discipline. Regular participation in the sacraments, shared worship, and spiritual guidance were not optional enhancements. They were protective structures designed to keep the believer integrated within a living spiritual reality rather than fragmented into private belief systems. What we are witnessing now, in many places, is the gradual disappearance of those structures from daily life. And in their absence, people are often left to navigate complex spiritual and moral realities alone, without the formation or support that once made that navigation possible. The result is not always immediately visible, but over time it becomes evident in the increasing sense of confusion many report about meaning, direction, and stability in their spiritual lives. It is here in this quiet confusion that the deeper crisis begins to reveal itself more clearly. If we continue following this line of observation, another layer becomes impossible to ignore. It is not only that individuals are becoming more isolated or less formed in their faith, but that entire systems of transmission have weakened at the same time. The way belief is passed from one generation to the next is no longer stable in many places. What once was naturally reinforced through family life, parish life, education, and culture now exists in fragments that often do not connect with each other. Traditionally, religious formation was never confined to one source. A child learned faith at home, reinforced it at church, and saw it reflected in the wider moral assumptions of society. Even when individuals strayed, there was still a consistent underlying framework that made return possible. Today, that shared framework has largely dissolved. The result is not just a decline in practice, but a loss of continuity. When continuity is lost, each generation begins almost from zero. Belief is no longer inherited in a structured way. It must be reconstructed individually. And in a culture saturated with competing narratives, that reconstruction becomes increasingly difficult. Many young people are not rejecting faith after serious consideration. They are growing up without ever fully receiving it in a coherent form in the first place. From a pastoral perspective, this creates a very different kind of challenge than in previous eras. The issue is no longer primarily confrontation with alternative belief systems, but absence. Silence where formation should have been, gaps where instruction should have been, and into those gaps, other influences naturally enter, not necessarily through force, but through repetition and presence. It is also important to recognize how rapidly the internal language of faith has changed in many contexts. Words that once carried precise theological meaning are now often used in vague or emotional ways. Concepts like grace, sin, redemption, and salvation are frequently reduced to psychological or motivational categories. While this may make religious language more accessible, it also risks detaching it from its original depth and structure. When theological language loses precision, theological thinking tends to follow. And when thinking becomes less precise, discernment becomes more difficult. People may still use the same words, but they are no longer necessarily referring to the same realities. This creates a subtle but significant form of confusion within religious communities, where agreement in language can mask disagreement in meaning. At the same time, there has been a noticeable shift in how authority is perceived within spiritual life. Earlier models of religious practice emphasized submission to a stable teaching tradition, interpreted through legitimate authority and sustained over time. In many contemporary settings, however, authority is increasingly treated as optional, negotiable, or purely advisory. Individuals often feel free to select which teachings to accept and which to reinterpret based on personal preference or emotional resonance. This shift has profound consequences for spiritual coherence. Without a stable reference point, belief systems become fluid. And when belief becomes fluid, practice becomes inconsistent. Over time, this can lead to a form of spiritual self-construction that lacks external grounding, even when it retains religious vocabulary. In pastoral experience, this often appears as a quiet tension within individuals who sincerely desire to believe but struggle to integrate that belief into a coherent whole. They may move between conviction and doubt, practice and neglect, engagement and distance, without a stable center that holds these experiences together. The result is not always loss of faith in an explicit sense, but fragmentation of faith into disconnected parts. It is within this fragmented landscape that deeper questions begin to emerge. Questions about meaning, about direction, about the reliability of inherited truth, and about whether spiritual life can still be sustained in a coherent way under modern conditions. These are not superficial questions. They arise from lived experience, from the pressure of navigating a world where the traditional supports of belief are no longer consistently present. And so the concern is not only what has been lost, but what has replaced it. Because when a unified framework dissolves, something always fills the space. Sometimes it is ideology. Sometimes it is psychological systems of self-understanding. Sometimes it is a mixture of spiritual curiosity and individual experimentation. But whatever form it takes, it inevitably becomes the new reference point through which reality is interpreted. At this stage, the question is no longer simply about decline, but about replacement. Not only what is fading, but what is forming in its place, often quietly, often without full awareness from those living within it. If we look more closely at what is replacing the older structures of belief, the picture becomes even more complex. In many cases, what fills the gap is not a single system, but a combination of influences that operate simultaneously. Psychological frameworks, self-help language, digital culture, and personalized forms of spirituality begin to merge into something fluid and adaptive, shaped more by individual preference than by inherited tradition. This does not always present itself as opposition to faith. In fact, it often borrows religious language while subtly shifting its meaning. For example, concepts like healing, inner peace, or awakening are frequently used in ways that sound spiritually familiar, but are no longer anchored in a defined theological structure. They become open-ended terms, interpreted differently depending on the context. While this can create a sense of accessibility, it also removes the boundaries that traditionally gave these concepts stability. Without boundaries, meaning becomes flexible, and when meaning becomes flexible, truth becomes harder to recognize with certainty. At the same time, digital environments have introduced a constant stream of competing voices into the formation of conscience. In earlier generations, moral and spiritual formation occurred within relatively stable environments, family, church, and local community. Today, those environments are often supplemented or even replaced by algorithm-driven spaces where content is continuously selected to maximize attention rather than formation. The result is that individuals are exposed to an unprecedented diversity of ideas, but without the corresponding structure needed to evaluate or integrate them. This constant exposure creates a subtle but persistent fragmentation of attention. Instead of a unified moral or spiritual framework guiding interpretation, individuals begin to shift between multiple interpretive lenses depending on what they consume at any given moment. Over time, this can weaken the sense of interior coherence. A person may sincerely desire clarity, but their mental and spiritual environment is structured in a way that continuously disperses it. From a pastoral perspective, this fragmentation does not always appear dramatic. It often manifests as restlessness, difficulty in sustained prayer, or an inability to remain focused on long-term spiritual commitments. Many people describe a sense that their inner life is constantly pulled in different directions, not necessarily because of one dominant influence, but because of many small, competing ones. This kind of internal division makes deep formation more difficult, even when the desire for it remains present. Another important development is the way moral reasoning itself has become increasingly individualized. Where moral norms were once received as part of a shared tradition, they are now often constructed through personal reflection, emotional response, or social negotiation. This does not mean that moral seriousness has disappeared. In many cases, people are deeply concerned with ethics and justice. However, the grounding of moral reasoning has shifted from objective reference points to subjective interpretation. This shift has consequences that are not always immediately visible. When moral reasoning becomes primarily subjective, consistency becomes harder to maintain across time and circumstance. Decisions that feel right in one emotional context may feel questionable in another. Without a stable framework, individuals may find themselves repeatedly revisiting foundational questions that were once assumed to be settled, leading to ongoing internal uncertainty. Within traditional Christian thought, moral and spiritual stability were closely linked. The idea was not that human beings would never struggle, but that they would struggle within a coherent structure that helped interpret their experience. Sin, grace, repentance, and growth were not isolated concepts, but part of an integrated vision of the human person's relationship with God. When that integration weakens, the individual parts lose some of their explanatory power. This is why the question of formation remains central. Formation is not simply the transmission of information. It is the shaping of perception itself, the way a person sees reality, interprets experience, and understands consequence. Without formation, individuals may still possess knowledge, but lack the framework needed to organize it meaningfully. And in spiritual terms, this means that even sincere belief can become unstable when it is not anchored in a coherent interpretive tradition. What emerges from all of this is a situation in which people are not necessarily less interested in truth, but more uncertain about how to recognize it. They are surrounded by information but lack integration. They are exposed to spiritual language but lack consistent meaning. They are engaged in moral reflection, but without shared reference points that would allow that reflection to converge into clarity. And so the deeper issue is not simply that older structures have weakened, but that the replacement structures are fundamentally different in nature. They are decentralized, individualized, and constantly shifting. They do not demand full adherence, they invite continuous revision. While this can appear flexible and open, it also makes long term stability more difficult to achieve. At this stage of the analysis, the central question becomes unavoidable. What kind of formation is still possible in such an environment, and what must be recovered if coherence, clarity, and spiritual stability are to be restored in any meaningful way? When we arrive at that question, what kind of formation is still possible? The answer depends on whether we are willing to recover something that modern life tends to resist: consistency. Not intensity, not occasional spiritual experience, but sustained, structured, and lived formation over time. Because without consistency, everything else eventually dissolves back into fragmentation. In classical Christian understanding, formation was never treated as a momentary decision or a private insight. It was a lifelong process embedded in rhythm, repetition, and accountability. Prayer was not occasional inspiration, it was daily discipline. Moral life was not self-defined, it was shaped through confession, instruction, and correction. Community was not optional. It was the environment in which truth was reinforced and lived. What has changed in modern conditions is not only that these practices are less common, but that the surrounding environment no longer naturally supports them. In earlier societies, even imperfect ones, the cultural structure reinforced the rhythms of faith. Today, the environment often works in the opposite direction. It rewards distraction, immediacy, and constant reinvention. Anything that requires patience or stability must now be intentionally chosen against the current of surrounding pressure. This is why recovery cannot be accidental. It requires deliberate reconstruction of practices that once existed organically. Regular prayer must be reestablished not as an emotional response, but as a fixed commitment. Participation in sacramental life must be understood again as central rather than peripheral. Moral formation must be reintegrated with objective reference points rather than left entirely to subjective interpretation. None of this is new, but all of it must be consciously recovered. From a pastoral standpoint, one of the most important steps in this recovery is the return to clarity about responsibility. Modern culture often encourages people to externalize their struggles, to interpret internal disorder primarily through external causes. While external factors are real and significant, classical spiritual thought insists that personal responsibility remains essential. Without it, formation becomes impossible, because growth depends on the ability to respond freely and consistently to truth once it is recognized. At the same time, it is equally important not to fall into the opposite error of isolation. Formation is not achieved in solitude. Human beings are not designed to sustain spiritual life independently of community and guidance. This is why the traditional structures of mentorship, confession, and communal worship were never optional additions but essential supports. They provided correction when perception became distorted, and encouragement when perseverance weakened. In the present context, recovering these supports may look different than in the past, but the underlying principle remains the same. Spiritual life requires accountability beyond the self. It requires voices other than one's own interpretation. It requires contact with a tradition that is larger than personal experience and deeper than immediate feeling. There is also a need to recover patience with the process itself. One of the defining characteristics of the current cultural environment is acceleration. Everything is expected to happen quickly, including personal transformation. But spiritual formation does not follow the logic of speed. It follows the logic of depth, and depth always takes time. Attempts to compress it into immediate change often result in instability or discouragement. This is why endurance is not a secondary virtue in spiritual life, but a foundational one. The ability to remain faithful through periods of dryness, confusion, or apparent stagnation is often what determines whether formation becomes stable or collapses. Many people do not fail because they lack desire, but because they expect progress to feel continuous rather than cyclical. If we step back and consider the broader picture, what becomes clear is that the challenge of the present moment is not simply moral decline or cultural change in isolation. It is the difficulty of sustaining coherent formation in an environment that is structurally resistant to it. That resistance is subtle but persistent, and it affects attention, memory, desire, and even the perception of meaning itself. Yet even within this situation, the possibility of recovery remains. not because the environment becomes easier, but because the principles of formation have not changed. Human nature has not changed. The relationship between grace, truth, freedom, and responsibility has not changed. What has changed is the density of distraction surrounding it. And so the final question is not whether formation is still possible in theory, but whether it will be chosen in practice. Whether individuals will intentionally step out of fragmentation and into structure again. Whether they will accept that coherence requires discipline, and that discipline requires surrender of certain comforts that modern life has made normal. Because in the end, the crisis is not only about what has been lost, it is about what must now be consciously rebuilt, one practice, one commitment, one act of fidelity at a time.